If today feels unclear, like something doesn't fully make sense anymore, even though it did just yesterday, this isn't random. There's a subtle shift happening in your perception, not in what's actually real, but in how you're experiencing it. You might notice hesitation returning, second-guessing thoughts, questioning decisions, a sense that something feels slightly off, even if you can't explain why. And that can be unsettling, because just recently, things felt more direct, clearer, more decisive. But now, that clarity seems less stable. Not completely gone, but not as solid as it was. And that creates uncertainty. You may find yourself replaying things again. Not just what you did, but whether it was the right move, whether you missed something, whether there's more to consider. And this time, the questioning feels different, less grounded, more fluid, more difficult to resolve, because the answers don't feel as fixed. They shift as you look at them, and that can make you feel like you're losing clarity, like something that made sense before no longer holds the same certainty. This is not a reversal. It's a distortion. The energy today doesn't remove direction. It blurs your perception of it. This is the beginning of a shift toward Mars approaching Neptune. And before that alignment completes, you start to feel it here. As uncertainty, as sensitivity, as a subtle disconnect between what you feel and what you know. So if today feels less stable, less clear, less certain than expected, it's not because you've lost direction. It's because your perception is moving through a phase where not everything appears as sharply as it did before. What you're experiencing today is not a loss of direction. It's a shift in how clearly you can perceive it. The momentum from the past few days is still active. The decisions you made, the actions you took, the direction you began moving in, none of that has disappeared. But something else has entered the picture. A layer of uncertainty, a softening of clarity, a change in how stable things feel. This is the early influence of Mars moving toward Neptune. And Neptune doesn't act like Mars. It doesn't push. It dissolves. It blurs edges. It softens certainty. It makes things feel less defined. So, when Mars, the force of action, starts moving toward Neptune, that direct, clear energy begins to mix with something less tangible, something harder to hold on to. And that's what you're feeling now. Not confusion in the sense of being lost, but confusion in the sense of not being able to fully grip what felt clear before. You may notice that your thoughts feel less fixed, more fluid, more open to interpretation. What seemed like a solid decision now has multiple angles. What felt certain now feels adjustable, and that can make you question yourself. Because your mind is trying to re-establish clarity. It wants something definite, something stable. But Neptune doesn't offer that. It shifts your focus from certainty to perception, from facts to interpretation. So instead of seeing things clearly, you begin to feel them differently. And feelings are more sensitive to change. They respond to subtle shifts. They pick up on things that logic doesn't always track. But they're also more vulnerable to distortion. That's why today can feel unstable, because you're not just thinking anymore. You're sensing. And sensing doesn't always come with clear boundaries. You may feel more aware of underlying dynamics, more sensitive to tone, to energy, to what's not being said, but at the same time, less certain about what it all means. And that's the shift. From clarity to interpretation. From direct knowing to subtle perception. So what you're experiencing today is not a breakdown. It's a transition. A moment where your awareness expands, but your certainty decreases. And that requires a different kind of stability. Not control, but grounding within uncertainty. This is where today becomes difficult to navigate. Because when clarity softens, the mind tries to compensate. It wants certainty back. So it starts analyzing, replaying decisions, reconsidering actions, looking for what might have been missed. And at first, that can feel useful, like you're being more aware, more thoughtful, more precise. But there's a line, and once you cross it, awareness turns into overthinking. You may notice yourself going in circles, revisiting the same thoughts without reaching a clear conclusion, seeing multiple possibilities without knowing which one is real. And that's the first trap. Trying to think your way back into clarity. But today's energy doesn't respond to force. The more you try to lock something down, the more it shifts. The more you analyze, the less certain it feels. Because the issue isn't a lack of information, it's a change in perception. So adding more thought doesn't resolve it. It amplifies the distortion. The second trap is emotional projection. Because when certainty decreases, your mind looks for something to hold on to. And often, it attaches meaning to feelings. A slight discomfort becomes a sign something is wrong. A moment of doubt becomes a signal you made a mistake. A change in tone becomes something personal. And none of these are guaranteed to be true, but they can feel true. Because your perception is more sensitive now, more open, more reactive to subtle shifts. And without clear boundaries, it's easy to misinterpret what you're sensing. You might read too much into situations, assume intentions that aren't confirmed, create narratives that feel real, but aren't grounded. And that's where misalignment deepens, not in your actions, but in how you interpret reality. There's also a quieter pattern today: self-doubt. You may begin to question your own clarity, not just your decisions, but your ability to trust yourself. And that's where this energy becomes tricky, because it doesn't just blur situations, it can blur your relationship with your own perception. So the real calibration today is not about finding perfect clarity. It's about recognizing distortion without reacting to it. Not every thought needs to be followed. Not every feeling needs to be believed. And not every shift in perception means something has changed in reality. So if something feels uncertain, don't rush to define it. Let it exist without conclusion. Because the moment you try to force certainty, you move further away from it. And the moment you allow uncertainty, your awareness begins to stabilize again. So how do you stay grounded when your perception feels less stable? You don't try to force clarity. You create stability without needing certainty. Because today is not about knowing everything clearly. It's about staying steady while things are not fully clear. Start by reducing the need to define everything. Not every thought needs an answer. Not every feeling needs a conclusion. Let some things remain open. Because when you stop trying to resolve everything, Your awareness stops overextending, and that alone reduces distortion. You can also shift your focus from interpretation to observation. Instead of asking, "What does this mean?" ask something simpler. What is actually happening right now? Stay with what is directly in front of you, not what you think it implies, not what it might lead to, just what is present, because reality is more stable than your interpretation of it. And when you return to that, your perception begins to settle. You can also slow your responses today, not out of hesitation, but out of precision. Give yourself more space before reacting to what you feel, because your initial interpretation may not be accurate, and with a little time, things often shift. Clarity returns in small ways, not all at once, but enough to guide your next step. You can also ground yourself physically, because when perception becomes unstable, the body becomes your anchor. Simple things help. Slowing your breath, feeling your surroundings, bringing your attention back to something tangible. This reconnects you to what is real, not just what feels real. And that distinction matters today. Because intuition still exists, but it's quieter, less reactive, less tied to emotional fluctuation. So instead of trying to interpret everything, listen more carefully to what feels steady, not what feels intense. Because intensity can be misleading right now, but steadiness is still reliable. So you don't need to stop your movement, you just need to move more consciously. Less based on interpretation, more based on what you can clearly observe. And when you do that, your direction doesn't disappear. It stabilizes, even in uncertainty. Let everything slow down here. Not to stop the movement completely, but to reduce the need to understand everything at once. Because today was not meant to give you full clarity. It was meant to show you what happens when clarity becomes less stable and how you respond to that. So, take a breath. Steady, controlled, unforced. And notice what remains when you're not trying to resolve anything. There's still awareness here, even if it feels softer, even if it feels less certain. It hasn't disappeared. It's just quieter. And from this place, you can begin to feel the difference again between what is actually present and what your mind is trying to create. Because not everything you thought today needs to be carried forward. Not every feeling needs to become a conclusion. And not every moment of uncertainty means something is wrong. Some of it was simply distortion, a shift in perception that made things feel less clear than they actually are. So you don't need to correct everything. You don't need to fix your direction. You just need to stay present long enough for your perception to settle again. Because clarity does return, not through force, but through stillness, through allowing things to realign naturally. And when that happens, what is true becomes easier to recognize again. Not louder, but more stable, more consistent, more grounded. So, as you move forward from here, you don't need to rush into decisions. You don't need to define everything today. You just need to carry awareness into your next moment and let clarity rebuild without pressure. And if this helped you stay grounded even slightly, keep that with you. Return to it when things begin to feel unclear again. And if you want to keep moving through these shifts with more awareness, more stability, you can come back here. Each day, not to find certainty, but to stay aligned even when certainty fades.